Hello students, welcome back. Just as a recap, last week we were talking about natural cellulosic fibers, and this week we are moving on to natural protein fibers. So we're still under the same umbrella of natural fibers. However, the ones we're going to be talking about in this lecture come from animals, whereas the fibers we were talking about last week come from plants and vegetables and that. So now we're moving on to a different type of natural fiber.
So here you see the properties common to all natural protein fibers, and they do come from animals, either the hair, the fur, or the secretion in the case of the silkworm. You'll note that the protein of wool is called keratin. You may have seen that terminology. It is used in hair products and skincare products. And the protein of silk is fibroin. And just to note that when you have cellulosic fibers, you have a combination of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But in protein fibers, you add the additional element of nitrogen. So that's the difference in terms of the composition. And just to talk a little bit about the properties of the protein fibers, on table 5.1 on page 91 in your textbook, you'll see a complete table, but here you see an abbreviated list. And just to point out a couple of things, the protein fibers have very strong resiliency and they are less likely to wrinkle, whereas the cellulosic fibers, we talked about how they wrinkle, like in the case of linen. You also have the hygroscopic property, which is that it does protect the body temperature a little bit better, especially in the case of wool. But wool and silk are also weaker when wet, so they tend to be a little bit more delicate fabrics. The other thing to point out is the natural flame resistance, so they don't burn readily or self-extinguish. And then when you do a burn test, you'll have an odor of burning hair, which will form a black crushable ash. So that's just something to consider, and you will see that when we do this test in the 300 level class.
We're going to start off our first natural protein fiber with wool. So wool was actually one of the most widely used textiles before the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was a time, late 1700s, early 1800s, when all of the processes for making yarns and the fabrics from those yarns and that sort of thing, all of that became mechanized. Everything was really done by hand before that. And then all of these machines like the loom and the cotton gin and these other machines came about to make all of these processes easier. So that's basically when, or shortly thereafter, in association with that time, is when the synthetic fibers started to show up. But prior to that, natural fibers really were the most widely used, and specifically wool. So today things are a little bit different because now, I think we talked about it in one of the other lectures, but today manufactured fibers have sort of taken over and they're the most used. So now the natural fibers are less widely used and as a result quite a bit more expensive. So today wool is considered a high cost and even in some circumstances kind of a luxury fiber, so to speak. But interestingly, it can't really be substituted by manufactured fibers. Those haven't reached the level where they can really copy the properties of wool from a synthetic perspective. So it still kind of retains its own special qualities that can't really be reproduced. So that kind of means there's still a demand for wool. In the U.S., production of wool started in the Virginia and Massachusetts colonies and spread from there. For reference of the actual fiber, I noted where in the swatch kit you can see both the wool fiber in the initial section and the end section of your textile kit, and then the other numbers are numbers of the swatches of fabrics that are made of wool. So take a look at those, kind of get a feel for them, and that way you can have a reference point for what we're talking about as we move on talking about wool. This is just a quick overview of how we go about getting the wool from the sheep and then the process it goes through to be spun into yarn. So first the sheep is sheared, and if you're interested in watching a video on that, there's a link here, and then it's also up on Canvas, so you can go see the sheep shearing process. But once the wool is taken from the sheep, it's inspected and graded and separated out according to which class it is. And then it's scoured to remove grease. The sheep are outside, they're living, breathing animals, so there's a lot of dead skin on there, sweat, residue, pesticides, all kinds of things. So it's cleaned off, and the lanolin removed from the wool is actually used in a variety of cosmetic products, such as hand creams and stuff like that. So the byproduct of this process of getting the wool fibers produces lanolin, which we can use in other things. Thereafter, the fibers are blended and straightened, and then it goes into yarn. So that's just kind of a quick overview of the process of getting the wool. In terms of where geographically the wool is coming from, the major producers of wool are Australia being the first, and then New Zealand, China, and Eastern Europe. So that's primarily where the wool is coming from. The U.S. does produce some wool, but it's quite minimal in relation to these other countries and geographic areas. So, and the wool that we're producing here is of a lesser quality. The merino sheep's wool is considered to be some of the best quality wools. It's long, fine, lustrous, and has good drape, but that's mostly produced in Australia. So we don't, in other words, we don't have the highest quality of wool that we're producing here, and primarily because we're on such a small scale. So most of the wool comes from other geographic areas. As far as types of wool, the lamb's wool is considered to be extra special when it's coming from an animal that's less than 7 months old. That makes sense. When you have younger animals, the wool tends to be softer. There's a little bit more luster as a result. So so that's considered to be an extra specially nice type of wool. Beyond that, there is a movement to recycle wool because, as I mentioned on one of the prior slides, that from a manufacturing process, we don't have fibers that are synthetic that are of the same level that we have with wool. So it's a little bit more scarce, so to speak. So as a result, there are efforts to use recycled wool. So when wool is being used for the first time, it's called virgin wool. Otherwise we refer to it as recycled wool. And there's no difference in quality with respect to this reuse. However, so we are still using the same type of wool, so it could be higher quality, lower quality, whatever the case is. You're not really necessarily giving up quality as a result of it being recycled. It's just being reused. This is a really great video that lays out the entire process from shearing the sheep all the way to finishing. So it'll give you a really good idea of how the process works. I would highly recommend watching it. So there's a link to the video in Canvas, but go ahead and take a look, and it'll really give a good overview of the entire process.
The physical structure of wool can vary depending on the length of the fiber. For example, longer fibers have more uniformity and are more compact, and they are traditionally used for worsted fabrics. That's a terminology you'll need to know. Worsteds tend to be used on suits and higher-end types of fabrics. Shorter fibers have less uniformity. They're more loosely twisted and softer, and they tend to be used on woolen fabrics. So one way to think of the difference between worsted and woolen: worsted is finer, more suiting oriented. Woolen would be more casual, lower price point oriented. So again, the longer fibers are more expensive, the shorter fibers are less expensive. And then again, on the surface contour of wool, we talked a little bit about that earlier, but the outside of wool actually looks a little bit like fish scales. It's very irregular, and on page 96 you can see the microscopic pictures of wool. And that's important because it ties into the characteristics of wool, the most important of which is crimp. And crimp is that unique ability of fiber to bend back and forward. You can see that in action on the picture at the bottom of the screen. But what's really happening is that that crimp is creating airspace between the fibers. And so when that happens, the air gets trapped and you have heat retention, which is what makes wool such a warm fabric to wear. The other thing that's going on is with those fish scales, there is felting, which is really the ability to mat the fibers together. And that can be a bad thing because when you have the felting, this mechanical action takes place where the scale edges interlock, and that normally is a result of heat or wetness, and what happens as a result is shrinkage. So I don't know how many of you have taken something wool and accidentally put it in the dryer and it shrinks down about 3 or 4 sizes. Well, that is what's happening, is felting. So that's not a good quality to have in a fiber, but it is definitely one of wool's most negative qualities.
Here's a picture representing what I was just talking about. So on the left you can see the original size of a wool sweater, and the red line is the outline of the entire sweater before it was laundered. And then on the right half of the picture you can see how much it shrinks. So you need to be really careful with wool when you're laundering it, because this definitely will happen. Like I said, I've accidentally done it a few times, and again, it does smell really weird when you wash wool. It's almost kind of like a fishy smell. It's very strange. But at any rate, so just note the launder care for wool, and it's the felting property that results in this shrinkage factor. The quality of the wool fiber is evaluated based on the fineness of the fiber, the length, the scale structure, the color, and the cleanliness, and basically the freedom from any damage. And this is true for most other fibers in addition to wool. So the length and the uniformity is super important in terms of quality, and fibers that are evaluated in this manner, that are longer and more uniform and softer, and that are generally considered higher quality and therefore have a higher cost. So that's kind of the difference between the different types of wool fibers, and this picture shows you the difference in length and what we're talking about here. So you can see merino wool fibers are quite a bit longer than some of the others, and for that reason merino wool is specifically stated on tags or on different, or it's labeled on the merchandise the way that it is, so that consumers can see it, because there is this general association of that type of wool with higher quality, and that justifies the higher cost associated with that wool. This is basically a reproduction of the table. Table 5.2 on page 93 of your textbook that goes into the properties of wool in more depth. And just a quick note about the slides so far and moving forward from here. When you see terms or areas of the slides that are in red and have asterisks next to them, that's how you know those are areas to focus on. That's not to say that other things won't show up on exams and that sort of thing either, but those are sort of the major takeaways and the ones that you're most likely to see on the exams. So just an aside as we move forward. But getting into the specific properties of wool, from an aesthetic standpoint, it doesn't have a lot of luster. Wool has a pretty matte finish, so not too shiny. It's a pretty durable fabric. It has pretty moderate abrasion resistance, and generally speaking, it's just a really durable fabric. Under the comfort umbrella, it's really, really absorbent, and interestingly, the wool resists wetting, which is why when it gets wet, the water kind of beads up on the surface. which kind of makes sense because the whole point of wool is to protect sheep from the severe weather that they're in. So so that's kind of what it does for us as well. So if you've ever been outside in a wool jacket and it's been raining, you'll notice little beads of water that are all over it. We've talked quite a bit about the thermal retention, but again, it's quite high for wool. And from an appearance retention standpoint, it has poor dimensional stability. So again, this refers to the shrinkage that we talked about earlier, which occurs from the felting property. So along these lines, the recommended care is to dry clean, at least when it comes to apparel, because again, if you stick anything wool in the washer, it's most likely going to shrink, and it's not going to come out looking how it did before it went in. So so these are the primary properties of wool to note. In terms of the environmental issues associated with wool production, the first one is that sheep graze in pastures, which causes soil erosion or relates to soil erosion. Additionally, their waste ends up contaminating water sources and that sort of thing. So there's an issue with that. Additionally, although sheep aren't necessarily killed for their wool, there is some concerns about how they are treated when they are being used for their wool. Additionally, there's a bunch of water and energy and chemicals that are used for the process. So despite the fact that it seems like an environmentally friendly process at the outset, there are some issues, and for this reason there's producers that focus on organic wools and that sort of thing. So a lot of times you'll see organic merino wool on the tags and that sort of thing in order to try and combat these issues. In terms of use, wool is used a lot in suits and sweaters and that sort of thing, and when you see the higher quality suits and those that are of much higher cost, those tend to be ones that are made out of 100% wool. Additionally, with higher cost and higher quality, winter items and blankets and things like that, all of that are going to be primarily made with 100% wool. That's what you'll see on the tag. Wool blends are more common in clothing that is lower cost, and that's to sort of give you some aspects of the wool properties, but the fibers are blended with either some other manufactured or synthetic fibers or that sort of thing to try and reduce the cost. So in less expensive apparel stores, the suits there, for example, will be made of wool blends instead of 100% wool. And actually, one of the ways you can get an idea of how much wool is in a particular garment or item versus not is by these trademarks on the right here that have been put out by the wool bureaus. So those will be on the tags or somewhere indicated on the wool items, and the wool mark indicates that the item is made of 100% wool, and the wool mark blend indicates that there's at least 60% wool in those items. So those are indicators of quality. As a result, they're going to be associated with cost, of course. So again, the 100% wool items being of higher cost than items that are made from blended fibers where wool is only a portion of the fibers that are in there. Apart from wool that comes from sheep, there are some specialty wools that come from some other animals. So I'm going to talk about some of those now. The first one that I want to go over is mohair, and you can see a sample of yarn from that fiber on N18 if you want to go take a look and feel that. Actually, with that particular one, it's 78% mohair, and then it's been blended with wool and nylon. So that one isn't 100% mohair, but you kind of get an idea of what the fiber feels like and looks like when you take a look at that example. But mohair's from the Angora goat, and it's mainly produced in South Africa. The structure, it's similar to wool, but it has fewer scales and there's no crimp. And as you can see from the sample here, it's a bit more lustrous than wool and also has a smoother feel. It has pretty good resiliency and it's pretty strong. It's also good for dyeing. So mohair sweaters and things like that tend to come in some pretty bright, pretty bold colors and whatnot. But it's less expensive than wool, but it's just another wool that comes from a different source other than the sheep. Cashmere is the second one here, and that you can find a sample of that under N21. There's a cashmere yarn there, and that's 100% cashmere. But that comes from the cashmere goat, and it's produced primarily in China and Mongolia. The structure is pretty solid. It's a fine scale fiber. Cashmere is known for its draping ability, however it is more sensitive to chemicals than wool, so you tend to find cashmere sometimes in a bit more natural colors. It depends on if it's a blend or not, but cashmere is considered to be probably more of a luxurious fiber. A cashmere sweater is usually going to be priced a bit higher, so it tends to be associated with higher cost, higher quality, especially if it's pashmina, which is a fine cashmere fiber that's produced primarily in India and Pakistan, and those fibers come from 4 distinct breeds of the cashmere goat. So it's almost like a facet of cashmere within the overall cashmere umbrella that's a bit nicer and considered to be of higher quality. I haven't seen a whole lot of full, let's say, apparel items, like larger scale apparel items made from it, but a lot of times it's associated with scarves and smaller pieces. Just as a point of reference, I put some pictures here of the animals that are responsible for giving us these fabrics. So we have the mohair goat there, and then the cashmere goat underneath. So they're pretty cute, actually. But and there's some photographs of the fabrics that come from these animals, or that result from the fibers from the fur of these animals. But this way you can just get an idea of where everything's coming from. Here are some pictures of some other animals that provide us with some specialty wools. You can see how cute some of them are. The Angora rabbit is kind of one of my favorites, actually. You can also see how hairy they are and how soft they look. So the fibers from these animals are quite soft. You can see the Angora, or yarn from the Angora rabbit under N19. You can feel how soft that is. It's actually quite nice. The camel hair yarn is N20, so you can feel that and kind of get a sense and feel the difference between those two. And then the alpaca yarn is N22. So these are just some additional animals that we pull some specialty wools from, and as a result of that, and with the sheep that we're pulling the merino wool from and whatnot, you can see why there's a movement towards protection and sustainability with respect to these animals, because we are still pulling quite a bit of fibers from these different species, and for that reason there's been a push to make sure that the animals are being treated well, of course, and that there's not a whole lot of resulting issues in the environment by virtue of producing the fibers from these animals. The next natural protein fiber we're going to talk about is silk. And a lot of times you'll hear people refer to silk coming from a silkworm, but it's actually a moth, and specifically the larva of the moth. So that's the animal that we pull silk from. And in your swatch kit on our N24, let me see here, is an example of the silk fiber, actually. And then right next to it, N25, you can see the yarn, the silk yarn that's made from the fiber. So after feeling it, you can get an idea of why it's considered a luxury fiber. And although there are some manufactured fibers that can mimic some of the properties of silk, and we'll get into that as we move into further chapters, there is the view that only silk is silk. There's nothing else quite like it, because it's such a specialized fiber and comes from such a specific animal. Silk is produced primarily in Japan, China, and India, so nowhere necessarily near the U.S. But it's kind of an interesting process, because up to this point we've been talking about the natural protein fibers that are found on the exterior of an animal as, part of their chemical makeup while they're out in the environment. With silk, it's actually produced by the animals. So what happens is the moths lay eggs that latch into the larva, and the larvae are fed continuously for about 6 weeks, and they eat a lot. So they end up eating about 50,000 times their initial weight. So they're made basically good and fat, so that way they can spin the fibers for us. But what they do is they create cocoons, and they secrete a stream of fluid from their glands that hardens when it's exposed to the air. And so they do this in a continuous process, so the silk thread is actually produced as one long continuous filament fiber. Now, you might remember from one of the prior lectures that we talked about most natural fibers being short, staple fibers. This is the one natural fiber that actually is a long, continuous filament fiber. So it's a bit different from some of the natural fibers. Once the cocoons have been created, they are treated with hot air, steam, or boiling water, and then that allows us to be able to unwind the fibers to create these long strands. Each cocoon yields about 1,000 yards, and it takes about 2,500 moths to create about a pound of raw silk. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how much it takes to create these fibers. But the silk is washed, and that's how we end up getting our silk. So wild silk is only available in certain colors, these more natural hues of like browns and cream and off-white and that sort of thing. So when you see colored silk, then that's been done through some sort of finishing process. The picture on the right gives you an example of what these fibers look like as well. Here's another video, and this one is about the production of silk, and it's taken from a factory in China where silk is produced. It's not a real long video, but it's available through Canvas, so go ahead and watch it, and it will tell the story a bit better.
Here we are taking a look at the physical structure of silk. As mentioned before, silk is the only natural filament fiber, and so it has an interesting characteristics. So the surface contour that you're looking at here, this is also found on page 110, figure 5.27. We talked about this a little earlier in the semester, that there is a triangular cross section that you see on the left, and it has no crimp or scale, which gives it that very smooth surface and adds to the luster and shine. This is the antithesis of the wool fiber, which has all of the scales that make it a much duller fiber. So you can see how the physical structure of the fiber can really change the characteristics of that fiber. Here we are taking a look at the properties of silk. This can be found on page 113, table 5.6. And some of the key points to note here are, first of all, the fact that silk is highly lustrous and has fantastic drape. In fact, that's why people use the terminology silky to describe that drape and luster combination. That is a key property of silk and always has been thought of in a very positive light. Another property that you might not think about as a positive is the fact that silk has very high thermal retention. I don't know if you've ever seen thermal underwear made out of silk, but it's actually pretty common. So it does keep the heat in. So that would be a plus in terms of one of the properties of silk. It's also resilient and abrasion resistant, and has pretty high tenacity for natural fibers. But on the negative side, you'll note that the recommended care is primarily dry clean. So that would be, for most people, not a positive property of silk.
With respect to the environmental impacts of silk, it is a reusable fiber, but generally speaking, the moths are susceptible to disease and temperature, so it's a production process that's a bit tricky. Apart from that, there's also some animal rights issues because most of the animals that produce the silk are killed in the process, and so there's some animal rights activists that have issue with that, and there's been sort of a negative response in that regard. Additionally, the production process is quite labor and cost intensive. The silk is produced in regions with low labor costs, so when prices fall, the areas tend to suffer, and then sometimes child labor ends up being used, so again, there's some issues there. So generally speaking, it's not the most efficient fiber, and the production of it is intensive on several different levels, so there are some environmental issues with silk. Nevertheless, it's a very versatile fiber, and it ends up being in different types of chiffons and velvets and that sort of thing. It's traditionally associated with more luxurious apparel and items made by brands that are priced at higher points. This is also true for textiles that you might find in a home or something like that. So the silks are kind of luxurious, a little bit more rare, and certainly associated with higher cost. So for this reason, silk has been imitated quite a bit by synthetic fibers, primarily rayon, to try and copy the luster and the drape associated with silk. So there are alternative manufactured or synthetic options. There is another type of silk, spider silk, so I have the little Spider-Man there, and it's produced from the spider's web, basically. It's got a lot of great qualities. It's highly elastic, hydroscopic, but it's been really difficult to farm, so I'm not sure we're ever going to see spider silk garments or fabrics at any point, but it does exist. So in this lecture we went over the natural protein fibers, and at the beginning of the lecture there was that chart that had in it the common properties of natural protein fibers. It'd be a good idea to compare that with the similar chart in the previous lecture on the cellulosic fibers, so you can kind of see what those differences are. For example, one of them being the chemical composition of these types of fibers. Additionally, we went in to talk specifically about wool and silk, and we talked about their shapes, the shapes of the fibers, the properties, noting the items in red, like I mentioned a few slides ago, and the uses for the different fibers. Also, at this point, now that we've talked about all the various natural fibers, I would spend some time with the fibers in the initial portion of your kit, and then go and check out some of the fabrics made from them within the kit. So just spend some time looking around, getting a feel, literally, for the different types of fibers, and just get yourself familiar with them. Here are the instructions for your third weekly activity, and this activity will be submitted just like the last one was through the discussion section on Canvas, so there will be a thread specifically for this activity. So just go in and type your response there, but what I'm looking to have you do this week is to go find something around campus or your home or a park or something that you are seeing out in the environment, and touch it, feel it, just get an idea of how it feels, and then go in and tell us what the item was, describe how it felt, and then compare it to the different properties and fibers that we've talked about already. So you can pick pretty much anything. It can be something natural. It doesn't necessarily have to be. It can be an animal. It could be a flower, a tree, even a friend's hair, anything. But use your imagination. Find something perhaps that you haven't really spent any time experiencing before. You don't have to answer in anything that's super long, just a couple of sentences, but keep in mind that it is due, just like the other activities, Friday at 5. So I look forward to reading your responses. Have a great week, and thank you. See you next week, or talk to you next week.